Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about categories, what are properly called more fully ontological categories. Because I guess anything could be a category, right? So we talk about the category of purple scarves and green pants and so on. But we're talking here about ontological categories, and those would be kinds or categories which are highly general, way up there in the level of generality, and not so specific as, say, a green pair of pants. Something like a substance or an event or a quality or a relation and so on. So these are known as ontological categories, but for short, they often just say categories. So some examples, so substance, event, boundary, space, time, property, relation, set, number, proposition, absence, like when we talk about a hole in a bagel, that would be, or a shadow, which is a absence or lack or privation of something. The way I'm thinking of it is that it's a entity that's in space or time and which is bounded by something, but the absence is a lack of something by which it's bounded. So that's what a hole in a bagel is, right? It's an absence or dearth of bread surrounded by bread. So I think, in general, one could define that sort of entity in that way. So holes and shadows are spatial privations because they have spatial dimensions. Right? But you could also conceive of temporal privations, like a silence. So what do we talk about? Like, let's have a moment of silence for our dear friend, unfortunately, passed away, that kind of thing. So there you're talking about what? You're talking about a time at which there is no sound, right? Which is bounded on both ends by times at which there are some sounds. It's not necessarily a spatial thing. I guess in the ordinary case it would involve space because noise is propagated through space also. But you might be able to imagine, say, that a completely non-spatial kind of being like a Cartesian soul who wasn't in space at all could still have experiences of these periods of silence. There needn't be any spatial relations or properties or dimensions associated with it. It could be purely temporal, that the spirit in question doesn't hear anything. Hears sounds and then doesn't hear sound. Then you'd have a purely temporal absence. So there seem, in principle anyway, from the very theoretical point of view, if you're not presupposing already, that the universe is a spatial temporal system in the way that Kant. We go back to Descartes, who thought the universe, and to idealists who believe in the possibility of non-spatial existence. non-spatial existence of actual substances. You could have purely temporal absences. That makes sense. So these are all examples of categories, and maybe you could think of more categories, but there's a pretty robust list here. We probably, in the end, wouldn't want to necessarily, in the final analysis, concede the irreducible existence of all of these things. I said, well, Aristotle, for example, inclined towards what we nowadays call a substance attribute ontology. It means that he thought that ultimately everything could be understood as either a substance, say like a tree, or an attribute. And he had a very rich view of all of the different kinds of attributes or properties of substances. So among these attributes are things like genera and species. The singular of genera is genus. Species doesn't really have a singular or plural, but species is the same thing. The plural and singular for species is the same as a species. So, but there is a distinction for genus versus genera, like many genuses. Genera. So at any rate, what are some examples of that relation? Well, it's basically like a set-subset kind of relation. The relation between a genus and a species. So the genus is the more general thing. So actually categories being highly general would themselves be genera, right? Very high level genera, very general kinds. So this sort of basic relation between genus and species, right? So for example, Aristotle said that man is a species of a higher kind, which is its genus. And he said that genus is animal. So that's a more general kind, because animal includes not only men, but also what else? What other animal? For example, a monkey, or a cat, or a dog, or a horse, right? They all fall under the same more general division of, or kind of animals. So you can have man, and you can have dog, and cat, and elephant. He actually had a very interesting account of how you could define the species in terms of the genus. You could come up with a definition of species in terms of its genus, and it's kind of the formula for doing like a general heuristic. You might say. He said you can define the nature of the species in terms of its genus by taking the genus of that species and adding to it what he called the specific difference. The specific difference is the thing that differentiates, in this case, man from the other types of animals. So if you can find a differentiating factor that makes men different than monkeys and dogs and cats and horses and elephants, right? And add that to the genus, which is what for man? Animal. So it says animal plus the difference between man and other animals is the definition of the species man. So what would that be?
Reason.
Yeah, that's what Aristotle said. So he said man can be defined as a rational animal. That's what that means. Or maybe an animal with a sense of humor. Would that work? Maybe. But we're not sure if, say, monkeys or dolphins. And they all may also have some degree of reason as well, right? But there's some sense of rationality, I guess, in which man plausibly has a degree of it that other creatures don't have. So even if we conceded that Aristotle wasn't 100% right, some other animals are rational Like a cat is rational, right? He or she will train you to get up in the morning. Right? And we'll have territorial battles with other cats. There's all kinds of rational planning, it seems. But still, they're not able to do like tensor calculus, right? So there's some maybe degree of rational capability which humans have, no other creature does have. And if you can specify that or define it, that would give you your definition. So he says the species equals the genus of that species plus the difference, the specific difference, meaning the difference that singles out that species from among the other species under the same genus. Ergo, Aristotle proposed that man is a rational animal, where this is the is of definition. We can define what a man is. Rational. Okay, so the genus is the more general thing. Now, a given species, though, can be a genus to a more specific species that falls under it. So a thing can be both a genus and a species at the same time with respect to different classes. So it would be a species of man. Yeah, something, right? Or whatever, yeah, something like that, right? Yeah, whatever you want, right? Right? So that would be more specific. So if you have, say, cat being a species of animal, then cat can be a genus to some other species that falls under cat, like calico. Calicos might have certain unique genetic properties. They can basically only be females. So like white, mainly white with orange and black patches on them. Generally can only be female. It's very difficult to get male calico. Maybe it happens like 1 in a billion. I'm not sure, but basically. Yeah, so that would be a species with respect to this genus, and this is a species with respect to that. Okay, everybody got that? Right, so you might develop a system of ontological classification using categories and the basic idea of a genus and a species. So there are different systems that have been proposed. So the system that I proposed for classifying all possible kinds of beings, this is before we've figured out like what the correct, minimal, most economical ontology or theory of the different kinds of things that exist, following Occam's razor, that we want to have the simplest theory, simplest account that we can. That's a big project, right? You have to look at all the problems of philosophy and see, like, and science as well, and see what list of entities, at a minimum, is going to be able to account for all of this. So prior to that, you might want to have a more general kind of view that says, let's try to classify all the possible kinds of beings that could turn out, to exist. So, and that's the kind of theory I'm looking at here. So I'm not assuming that all of these kinds of entities are going to ultimately be accepted, but they're all candidates. So they're all possible. So sense. Say there's a possible world where these things exist, or they're all. It's an open question that any of them might exist at this point, given what we know, or which is a kind of epistemic possibility, saying we can't, at this point, rule out any of these because we're just starting, and we talk about all these different kinds of things in different contexts. People say that the shadows scared them, or that they fell into a hole, or people say that this event produced that event, or that there are substantial objects and insubstantial objects. That numbers exist, right? Like there's a prime number greater than 3, right? Or that there are an endless number of prime numbers, as Euclid proved thousands of years ago, and so on. So we speak of the existence of all of these sorts of things. Right, so there are these different schemes of ontological classification that we could use at the start of doing ontology, and these, like I say, are provisional. You might narrow them down to say, well, I can get by just with substances and attributes, so that's going to be my ultimate theory, but I haven't shown yet that that can handle everything without also having to bring in space and time, or absences, or numbers, or whatever. So that's the whole enterprise of metaphysics, is to figure that out. But we shouldn't expect to have all the answers right at the start. So one system that's been put forward says that the highest category, or whatever, is being or existence. So everything falls, that's sort of a universal category. Right? So we're not going to admit anything to exist unless it's a being. That doesn't tell you much. And it applies to everything. So there are beings, and then you want to have like 2 main kingdoms of beings. So if you think of the analogy to biology, where classification is also very important, according to the traditional view, the highest category within biology, what you might call the highest genus, or the summum genus, was what? Living thing. And then you broke it up into 2 main kingdoms of living things, which was supposed to cover every living thing, and such that no thing can belong to both kingdoms. And what was proposed was what? That there are animals and plants. So that was, say, so if you had organisms as your highest genus, then you could have the animal king, right? Animal and vegetable. Animals and plants. And then what would you have? Under animals, you'd have different species of animals, and then different species of plants on the other side. Then subspecies, right, of those, and varieties, right? Tribes, classes, whatever. Orders, right? So you might divide animals into what? Into like vertebrates and invertebrates or something. Right? Plants into chlorophyll-bearing plants and non-chlorophyll, right? Nowadays, nobody even, they've rejected this system. You need more categories, it turns out. I think they have 5 at the second level. Because fungi are classified separately from chlorophyll-bearing plants, like right from the start. And I got about 5 different kingdoms under living things. Ones that have nuclei in their cells and ones that don't. A nucleus, as opposed to just like a DNA strand, whatever they're called, eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Anyway, but that's biology. So what would we have under beings? That's the big question here. What should be the next division? Anyway, so the theory that I proposed said that a useful way to go about this, and by the way, I don't think there has to be necessarily just one way of proceeding, either in biology or in ontology. It might be that for different purposes, different systems of classification can be equally legitimate. I mean, why does it have to be just one way? I mean, you might have a given subject matter that could be sliced, categorized in different ways. It doesn't follow from that even that there's any disagreement really between the two systems. They might include all the same objects in the end, but just put them into different boxes. Right? So if you have beings as your highest genus, your next thing could be that there are abstract, well, I should say concrete beings and abstract beings. And then under concrete beings, you would have the beings here that are concrete. The categories that we have here would fall under, some would fall under concrete and some under abstract. So for example, numbers and sets are abstract entities. Because, for example, one of the sets, the basic set, is called the empty set, which has nothing in it at all. It doesn't seem to be a concrete being of any sort. And starting from that, you can generate infinitely, endlessly many sets. So you get this whole universe of sets out of nothing, essentially. So what would be a concrete entity on the other hand? Say something like a substance or an event, or whatever, right? And that's sort of the intuitive idea. It turns out to be very difficult to tricky and difficult to precisely define this abstract concrete distinction. We might just accept it intuitively, or we might try to come up with a definition of it. As a first try, as a first approximation, people said that concreteness is intimately bound up somehow with space and time. Things that are in space, well, one preliminary definition might be that something's concrete if and only if it's in space or time. And that seems to work for a lot of the cases, that concrete entities are spatial or temporal entities. They're located in space or time. Others have said they have to be in space and time, whatever, but something along those lines. So, like the empty set isn't, right? It's not located. I can't say like the empty set is on the table or it's in Europe right now. It's going on a grand tour or flying it from, right? Same thing with the number 7. Like where would it be, right? You can't say that the number 7, it seems, has any particular location in space or time, right? So that would be kind of a preliminary definition. There are some possible counterexamples to it, especially if you're looking at all possible categories. One example that's often put forward is God. God would seem to be a concrete entity, not an abstract entity, because God's a substance. I mean, God's supposed to be like a super person, according to the traditional definition of God, which is what I'm assuming here. Of course, you could have some other idea of God, whatever, but given the traditional Judeo-Christian Islamic conception of God, God is basically a person who has intentions and has knowledge and power and is good and has all these personal qualities. Right? It's kind of like a super person. On that reading, God would be a substance and therefore would be a concrete being. Does that sound right? It wouldn't be an abstract entity like the number 7. Right? Another thing that's closely associated with the idea of concreteness is the idea that concrete things have causal powers. course, that's a different criterion than the one about being in space or time. But you can see God also meets that one, too. God has causal powers, whereas numbers and sets don't do anything. Concrete things like a table or a chair have causal powers, right? Like a chair will attract, by gravity, say, other chairs. Or it has the power to break something if it's thrown, or to burst in flames if it's lit. And so it has all these dispositional causal traits. Right? So God's got that too. So it looks like God's a concrete being, according to a lot of the intuitive criteria of what makes something concrete. Yet is God in space and time? Certainly not in space. Right? According to orthodox theology, he's not in time either. Of course, we might reject that part of orthodox theology. I mean, the Bible speaks of God as being in time, even though the theologians don't. Right? God interacts with Moses, right? And meets with him and talks with him through the burning bush and all the stuff, and all of that seems to put God in time. But the traditional theologians of the Middle Ages said that God was totally eternal, outside of the flow of time. There is an alternative, right? I mean, we could say God's outside of time, or we could say that God is everlasting, which is what you would say if you think that God is in time, that God never began and never will end, that he has infinite existence in time, but still is in time. So if that's the case, we don't really have a problem with God, because he'd be in time. It would turn out to be concrete. But if you go with the Orthodox reading, or if you believe that there could be some kind of spirit who's outside of time, at least in theory, and I think there could be, you have a problem with defining abstract as being in either space or time. Here's how that could work. Suppose you have some kind of purely spiritual being like God who's outside of space. And suppose this being, unlike God, is more like Aristotle's God. I don't know if you know about Aristotle's God. Aristotle was born way before Christianity came into being. Of course, there was Judaism already, but he wasn't Jewish. Anyway, he thought that there was some kind of prime mover of the universe, kind of ultimate being. But this being never did anything. Yeah, well, and that's called deism, actually. D-E-I-S-M, yeah. That's what the founding fathers believed in. But they believed that God did one thing, which was create the universe, and then he's called the divine watchmaker. He winds it up, and then he goes out and doesn't interfere anymore. So that would still give God like some powers. Aristotle, though, thought that all that God did was think, and all that he thought about was thinking. So he thought of God as a being who just thinks about thinking all the time, so to speak. It's not clear that a being like that has to be in time, because it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't change. All it does is just think that it thinks. He had some elaborate explanation of how that being could cause other things to happen, but it didn't cause them through ordinary causation. When we say that concrete things have causal powers, we mean what Aristotle would put by saying that they can be efficient causes. Aristotle had 4 causes. Anyone know about the 4 causes of Aristotle? You know them? You know them? No one knows. Okay. Aristotle said there were 4 causes, sometimes referred to as the 4 B causes, because only one of them is really a cause in the modern sense, which is the efficient cause. So Aristotle said some causes are efficient causes. These are causes that effectuate change by virtue of a change. So an efficient cause is something that changes and thereby produces change. So a sculptor will cause, as an efficient cause, the existence of the statue because he takes his chisel, right, and hammers. Michelangelo carved out the statue of Moses, right? So those activities are the efficient, of Michelangelo's are the efficient cause of the statue existing in the way that it does, statue of Moses, because it's a bunch of changes that produce some other changes. That's just one type of cause, the efficient cause. That seems to be the way, though, that we use the word cause now, is to refer to exclusively to efficient causes, more or less, right? When we think of causes, we think of like striking a match, causing it to light, right? So we think of a motion producing an effect. Okay? But he had three other causes. He also had what he called the formal cause. A formal cause is very much like the genus plus a specific difference thing. So it's when you explain something through its definition or through its essence or form. So his example was if you ask, why is there an eclipse, like a solar eclipse? Why is there an eclipse? He said the answer is because the moon is interposed between the earth and the sun. That's the cause, right? But you'll notice that that's the definition of what an eclipse is, right? So we're giving the cause, or it's really more of an explanation, right? Giving the explanation or the cause of a phenomenon by defining the phenomenon in question, of an eclipse in this case. So that's called a formal cause. Doesn't involve any change or motion or anything. You're just giving the definition of the thing. Right. Why is there an eclipse? Because the earth is because the moon is between the earth and the sun. So that's a formal cause. Then there's a material cause. Material cause is when you explain something by the matter of which it's made. Suppose you ask, why is this table hard? What's the explanation? Because of what it's made of. Suppose it was made of marshmallows, marshmallow stuff, or foam rubber. It wouldn't be hard then, right? Well, what is it made of? Something like what? Wood or formica or whatever, right? If something's made of that, it's going to be hard, right? Because the matter of it is hard. So we said we can often explain things or give the cause of it by reference to the matter of which it's made. So far we have three causes: efficient, formal, and material. And there's a fourth cause, which he calls the final cause, because that's the last one. No, that's not the reason. The final cause is the most curious, and that's the one that relates to his theory of God. Whatever. The final cause has reference to purpose or to teleology or goal-directedness. Like, why does a giraffe have a long neck? Why are giraffes long-necked? Yeah, exactly. Because the answer that was given was because that way they can reach the food that they need to eat, which are the leaves on these really high branches. Okay. But you'll notice here that it looks like the cause or the because is something that comes after the phenomenon that you're trying to explain. So they have long necks, right? But if you say the reason they have long necks or the cause of their having long necks is they're getting the food off of the high leaves, that's something that happens later than they're having long necks, right? So it looks like what you have here with the final cause is that the cause can come after the effect, which seems weird, right? Certainly with efficient causes, it's not that way. The cause always comes before the effect. you strike the match first and then it lights. But here it seems peculiar that what explains why giraffes have a long neck is that they can get food from the high branches, which happens after they have long necks. Pretty strange, right? A final cause has to do with purpose, and the only place where it still seems to play a really prominent role anymore is in biology. That's why I gave a biological example. Aristotle thought you could have final causes even in physics, but that's not accepted by hardly anybody anymore. When you introduce them, you're introducing the idea basically of purpose, right? You're saying that giraffes have these long necks because the purpose of it is, right, the function of it is to enable them to reach the leaves. Final causes, though, do seem legitimate within biology. Right? It seems like we are explaining, in a way, why they have long necks. So we're giving, like, the evolutionary purpose of having these structures. So at any rate, Aristotle thought that the prime mover, who never does anything except think about his thinking, he thought that that being moved things in the world as a final cause. He thought that other beings in the world would try to emulate the perfection of the prime mover. And in so doing, they tried to copy what he did, and that the only way they could do it, if they were non-thinking things, was by moving in circles. Because sort of like thinking about thinking is sort of, it's like circular process, right? So he thought that like the planets and stars rotated in circles because that was the closest they could come to thinking about thinking. So go in circles. So that was their goal. But it's not like God actually does anything to move them, right? God doesn't do anything. He's not an efficient cause of these things. So look, could you have a being then that was purely spiritual, incorporeal being? And Aristotle did think of the prime mover as an incorporeal being, as one that had no bodily form, who just thinks about thinking. Generally, Aristotle was quite materialistic, but he had this one exception for God. He certainly thinks of beings like us, human beings, as not having some kind of separate spiritual soul. He thinks of us as essential, necessarily, that our minds are embodied in organic materials. But he didn't think that of the prime mover. So could you have some kind of God-like being then who doesn't exist within the realm of space at all? It's a pure spirit who thinks, right? But thinks about nothing except for eternal, unchanging mathematical truths. Suppose the being's mathematically omniscient, and knows all the truths of mathematics and logic, and it does nothing except contemplate with its infinite mind these infinite mathematical truths, and it never does anything except contemplate these unchanging truths. It seems like such a being plausibly could be totally outside of time, since it never does anything. It engages in no actions, and all it does is focus on things that don't change, right? Mentally focus on things that don't change. One could make the case that that being would be a concrete being, nonetheless. It would be a substantial soul. Substantial being, which is not in space and not in time, but not an abstract entity. I mean, it wouldn't be like a number or a set or something. So there still seems to be a problem for defining abstract and concrete in terms of being in space or time. Any question, comment on any of that?
Now, could we fit any of those categories under that?
Yeah, well, I mean, Sure. I mean, we could say here, under concrete, we'd have substance, right?
So for like space and time, would you put that as an abstract meaning?
No, these definitely concrete, because concreteness is, remember, the first definition of concreteness is that
Because it's in
it's space and time, so clearly space and time themselves are concrete things, like this particular region. We shouldn't confuse concrete with substantial. I mean, you could confuse them very easily. And, I mean, you could just decide, I mean, there's probably like a line in Webster's dictionary under concrete where one of its meanings is substantial, but then there's another meaning, which is more general. Yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah. So, but it's all in what you mean. But the puzzle is what exactly is meant by concrete and abstract. But it seems clear that space, places, and times, and what else? Absences, right? There's spatiotemporal things, at least on one interpret, right? Like the hole in the donut and the shadow. Right? Absences. These are all concrete. Boundaries, right? Like the boundary between Texas and Oklahoma. It's a spatiotemporal. Substance, events, right? Definitely events are concrete, like hurricanes and blizzards. Definitely concrete. All right, and then all the rest of them would be abstract, right? Like properties, like the property of being a unicorn, which we could call unicornicity. And what would the property of being a cat be called then? Being a cat, we could call that catness or felininity. Which do you like better? Catness is easier to spell, so I'll go with that. And what would be the property, abstract quality of dogs? Dogness or canininity. Canininity, yeah, or dogness. And for horses, it would be horseness or equinity. So these would be abstract entities, right? Notice it seems like some of them might exist in the absence of any actual concrete instance of that quality. Aristotle denied that. Aristotle thought that all of these sorts of properties must be had by some actual creature to exist. No, but Plato denied that. Plato, who was Aristotle's teacher. Plato said you could have qualities that are never actually possessed or exemplified or instantiated in anything at all, like being a unicorn or a mermaid or a flying horse or whatever. Whereas Aristotle said they don't really, those properties aren't real. The property only becomes real when something possesses the property. So Aristotle says there is dogness and catness and horseness and all that, but there isn't any such thing as dragonhood or unicornicity, unless there are actually like dragons and unicorns on other planets or something. He also thought that properties could go in and out of existence. So like if dragons did exist for a while, say at Hogwarts in Romania or whatever, right? The school of witchcraft, and if they actually, there was such a place on some other planet, right? Or in some ancient time, but they became extinct, then the property would go out of existence when it became extinct. So like the property of dodo birds and passenger pigeons don't exist anymore, though they once did, for Aristotle. But for Plato, properties are eternal. They never go out of fashion. They're always around. And you can even have ones that never were real at all, that are just mere possibilities. But we'll talk more about that in the unit on nominalism and realism, where we get into the problem of universals. But I did want to mention that. So either way, though, whether you're an Aristotelian or a Platonist, properties on either view are going to be abstract entities. I mean, they don't have any clear location in space and time. Like, where is dogness located exactly? Is it where a rover is, or where Fido is, or where a spot is? Right? Not clear where it is, right? If it's where all of them are, then it seems like one thing's in many places at the same time, which doesn't seem particularly coherent. And anyway, they certainly can't say it's in all these different places. And it seems like if you just say, well, it's the collection of all of these things, then it seems like you're confusing a property with a collection, which is a different category. I think we could put that one up here. It's very similar to set, but the difference is sets are abstract and collections could be defined as concrete. I'll explain what the difference is. The difference is that a collection must have at least one actual element, whereas a set could be empty. So collections would be groupings of things that exist, and without, like a collection of stamps. So to have a collection of stamps, you need at least one stamp. And collections have parts, so each stamp in the collection is a part of that collection. Whereas a set doesn't have parts in that sense. It has what are called elements. So like the set of the numbers 1, 2, and 3 has as its elements the number 1, the number 2, and the number 3. Elementhood and sethood are different relations and obey different logical principles. The major differentiating factor is that proper parthood is transitive as a relation. So if A is part of B and B is part of C, then A is part of C. So think about that. If the electrical plate is part of the wall and the wall is part of the room, then the electrical plate is part of the room. Okay. So parthood is transitive. Transitivity is defined in general in terms of for any x, y, and z, right? If x bears the relation to y and y bears it to z, then z bears it, then x bears it to z. That's a transitive relation. So parthood is transitive, but elementhood is not transitive. So if you have a set, say the set of the number 1, right? So then 1 is an element of that set. And then if that set's an element of a bigger set, like the set containing that set, will 1 be an element of the big set? No. It's not an element of the big set just has one element, which is a set of containing 1. It doesn't have 1 as one of its elements. So elementhood is not a transitive relation. It should not be confused with parthood, and that breaks sets and collections into two different categories. One of which is an abstract being, and the other is going to be a concrete being, I think. At least if you stipulate that the only parts of collections are concrete beings. If you don't stipulate that, then it's going to be tricky to figure out what collections are. I mean, if collections can have abstract parts too, I'm saying, then it looks like the whole idea of that kind of collection may be incoherent, because it's not going to be possible to really say whether it's abstract or concrete. So I think it's tidier to say we have abstract sets which follow an elementhood relation, and then we have collections of concrete things which follow part-whole rules. and which are concrete. So under concrete, we'll have collection, but under abstract, we'll have then properties, relations. An example of a relation would be a betweenness. So relations relate different things to each other in general, as opposed to properties which just attach to a single object that has that property. Like Rover has dogness. But betweenness would require 3 objects, one of which is between the other 2. And so you have properties, relations, sets, numbers, propositions, like the proposition that 1 and 1 is equal to 2. These are all abstract entities. You might be able to come up with some other kinds of abstract entities as well. But that seems a pretty healthy list we've got there. And then you could have subspecies of these kinds of things, like different kinds of substance, like what? Material substances and souls. Or under events, you could have physical events and spiritual events, and so on. Under boundaries, you could have spatial boundaries and temporal boundaries, right, as subcategories, and so on. So that's one kind of way of proceeding with ontological classification. Like I say, the big issue raised here is how do we define the abstract concrete distinction? So how would we do that? And we might go with it's either in space or time thing, right? And that'll work for most of the cases. But I don't think it's absolutely right because of the problem of God or of some kind of timeless, spaceless mind that could exist. Right? There's also some issues with are spaces and times themselves in space and time? Right? It doesn't seem like spaces are in space, for example. They're parts of space, but they're not in space, because what space would they be in? Like some other space? They just make up space. They're not like in space. And they needn't be in time either, it seems, if you could have a universe in which there's space but no time, which seems a likely possibility. I mean, it seems like you could have space without time if you had space without any change occurring. It's like a static. There used to be like a Twilight Zone. I don't know if this was an old program on TV, like back in the 1950s. This guy had this stopwatch, and if he clicked it, like everything would freeze. Right. So if you could just like stop everything, it seems like time would come to a halt. It seems like you could still have space. So it seems like spaces don't have to exist in time necessarily, and they don't exist in space themselves, because that leads to like some kind of infinite regress of like metaspaces or something, which is completely implausible. Like there's another space that every space is in. Not too plausible. Like that, there's just space. So it doesn't seem like we can say that every concrete thing is either in space or in time. And I guess you have a similar problem with times, right? Are times in time? No, it's the same thing again. And again, times don't seem to require space, not if Cartesian souls are possible. So there are some problems with this whole spatiotemporal simple spatiotemporal approach. I do think that spatiotemporality has to do with this distinction. But it's a little more subtle than just saying it's either in space or time. So let me tell you how I think it goes. I think you have to bring in the idea of categories themselves in order to define the abstract concrete distinction. That entities are concrete or abstract partly because of the category to which they belong. And I do the analysis in terms of this idea of a category of a certain level of generality, which I call a level C category, which means it's at the third level. So you can see in this chart here that this beings would be the highest level, and then the next highest would be the concrete abstract distinction. And then the third level down is where all this stuff is at. And intuitively, all of these categories or kinds here seem to be at the same level of generality. Just intuitively, right? They seem to be equally general and rather high up in the hierarchy of classification. So, given that idea, what I want to do first is have a list, which I call L. So let L be this list of categories, including all these things here. Okay? But it's a finite list, right, containing these examples here. Okay? So this is in order to define the level C. Why is level C important? Because I think we could definitively capture the abstract concrete distinction this way, that an entity E is a concrete entity or a concrete being, if and only if it falls under a level C category. For example, one of these ones on the list L. Though we certainly don't want to limit it to the ones on the list L, and that's the tricky part, because there might be others that we haven't listed, right? Okay, so an entity E is concrete if and only if it falls under a level C category, such that that category can have instances possessing either spatial or temporal parts. That is, parts that have either spatial or temporal dimensions. So it belongs to a category, say God. Now God, or one of these intellectual beings who's outside of space and time and just thinks about thinking or just thinks about numbers or whatever, right? We've said is going to be a substance, right? So it's going to fall under the category of substance. The category of substance is a level C category which can have other instances which do have spatial or temporal parts, like tables and chairs, which have what kind of parts? Spatial parts, right? A spatial part is a part of a thing which has spatial dimensions. So most of our familiar substances do have spatial parts, like legs and tabletops and so on. And in general, the level C category of substance is going to have many instances which have such spatial or temporal parts. God belongs to that category. So by virtue of keeping company with these other things, God turns out to be a concrete being because he's a substance. And substances in general are concrete because the category of substance can have cases of entities in it which have these spatial or temporal parts. So this enables us to not require that every substance has to have spatial or temporal parts to be concrete. It's just got to be a substance, right? And once it's a substance, it possibly has some instances which have spatial or temporal parts, which will make God and other non-spatiotemporal substances still concrete beings because they're in that category of substance. So the definition of concrete is that it falls under a level C category, which is capable of having instances possessing spatial parts or temporal parts. Temporal parts would come in with things like events, right? Events can have temporal parts. Like suppose you have some thought of a Cartesian soul that doesn't exist in space, it thinks of visiting Nebraska or something like that. It's a purely non-spatial event, but it has temporal parts because all events are going to have temporal parts, like the first half of that event and the second. The first half of the thought is lasted for a second, and then there's a second half of the thought. So, will all events have temporal parts? Maybe not, right? Like you might have instantaneous events, right? That don't. But still, in general, the category of event is such that, right? It's a level C category, which can have some cases in it that have temporal parts. If you go to the abstract side, you'll find that none of those categories over there can have instances that have spatial or temporal parts. Properties can't have spatial or temporal parts. Propositions can't. Sets can't. They can all have elements, not parts, right? What else? Relations, propositions, none of them have, right? Even if you think of properties as having some kind of location in space, they don't have parts by which you can disassemble them into components that have spatial or temporal dimensions. So is it legitimate, though, to use the notion of a level C category? Or does that somehow presuppose the idea of concrete and abstract, making the whole thing circular? Because if we're saying it's level C because it's the third one down, then maybe we only got to that idea because the second one down was the concrete abstract distinction. Makes the whole thing a big circle, right? So what you got to be able to do is define level C without using the concepts of abstract or concrete at all. I think you can do that in relation to the list L without ever bringing in the concrete abstract distinction. So how do you do that? Okay, well, here we use our ideas of species and genus, which I think are sufficiently clear, right? So the idea here is that a category is at level C, right? If and only if, first of all, it's neither a species nor a genus of anything on the L list. So you got that? So it's not going to be something higher up that is more general than the things on the L list. To be at level C, right? Obviously, abstract and concrete aren't at level C. They're at like level B or something, right? And being is at level A, right? And mental event is at level D, right? Further down below level C, whatever, and so on. So the first thing is to be at level C is to not be more general or less general than what's on L, right? So if we have a species of anything on L, it'll be at level D. And if we have a genus of anything on L, it'll be at level B. It'll be like concrete or abstract or whatever. So to be at level C is first to be not a species or a genus of any category on our L list. Okay. But what about if the category is not on L? Because we can't like assume that we've listed every possible kind of being here, right? There might be others, right? That we've left off. I could give you some, whatever. So you need a second condition, and this is laid out on page 84 of the Historical Dictionary of Metaphysics under concrete abstract distinction, which is included in the reading. Okay. Secondly, it's not a species of a category that's not on L, right? Which meets the condition that I've just put forward. So suppose there's some category not on L that meets this very condition. That is, it's not a species or a genus of anything on L, even though, right, it's not on L. Okay. Then what you want to say is that a category is at level C if it's not a species of a category that's not on L, and that is itself not a species or a genus of anything on L. So in other words, it won't be something too specific of a category that's not on L. And I think that will get you your level C categories in general. So then we can move ahead with this definition of a concrete entity as one that falls under a level C category, and which can, such that that category can have instances with spatial or temporal parts. And an abstract entity will be an entity that falls under a level C category that can't have any instances that have spatial or temporal parts. So it's all determined by its level C category and whether that category can support objects or instances of that category. Having parts that are in space or time, parts that have spatial or temporal dimensions, actually. So I see the idea of having spatial or temporal parts as being crucial, but also it still wouldn't get you to the goal unless you had this idea of being part of a broader category. I think we classify these objects as concrete or abstract by reference to the basic level C category they fall under. Even if they deviate from the paradigm case of that category, like God deviates from like the normal concrete thing, he still remains concrete because he shares predominantly many of his concrete characteristics with the paradigm cases. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a substance. I mean, there's other stuff, obviously, about God that makes us classify him as concrete, even if God doesn't have spatial or temporal parts, which God doesn't, clearly. Probably things like possessing causal powers, for example, which, in the sense of an efficient cause, doesn't apply to any abstract entities. You may say, why not use that as our definition? Right? Why not define a concrete thing as something that has causal powers, and an abstract thing as something that lacks causal powers? Well, that might be viable. There are some problems with that one, too, though, which makes this approach preferable because you avoid those problems. The main problem is that most philosophers hold the view that causes and effects are all events, so that the only concrete things, if you say that concreteness is determined by having causal powers, will be events, and everything else will turn out abstract, which is wrong. So the standard view of causation is that the relata of the relation of causation are events. So you have event one causing event two, that kind of thing. So if all causes and effects are events, then it looks like events would be the only concrete things, but that leaves us substances and spaces and time and all that. Yeah, all kinds of things, yeah. So we might say that having causal powers is sufficient to make something concrete, but it doesn't seem to be a necessary condition. But I'm putting forward a necessary and sufficient condition here, which is for concreteness, which is belonging to a level C category, capable of being instantiated by something that has parts that have spatial or temporal dimensions, right? And abstract entities are entities that are not concrete, that don't meet that condition. So anyway, that's the proposal. I suggest that you have a look at the layout of it in the dictionary entry on abstract and concrete. One of the interesting claims about categories that's often put forward is that categories have to be or represent essential qualities or necessary qualities of the objects that instantiate them. But this says that if something falls under a category, then that same thing couldn't fall under, even possibly, under any other category. So it couldn't change its categorical allegiance. So if you had an event, it couldn't become a substance or a boundary or a time or a place. Or whatever. That these express essential attributes or necessary attributes of the things. So you might think that some qualities are not necessarily possessed by some things. Like you might think a piece of wax, for example, could be a sphere at one moment of time, and then when it melts due to a flame being applied to it, as Descartes imagined in his piece of wax argument, the wax changes its shape, so the substance changes from being round to being square through melting. So that would mean that the shape of the wax, the roundness or the squareness, would be a contingent or accidental quality of the wax. The wax can survive the loss of that quality while remaining the same object or substance. In contrast, categories are often thought, I think pretty plausibly, to express essential properties. It's really hard to conceive of an object changing its category and remaining the same thing. Like how would a number become, say, an event? Or how would an absence become a substance? Or, right, any of these. So this is called the doctrine of categorical essentialism, which is that categories express essences or necessary natures. And it seems pretty reasonable. I mean, even in application to some of the conundrums we see in modern physics, for example, light. There's a thing called wave-particle duality, which says that under some conditions, light behaves exactly like a wave. Under other conditions, it behaves exactly like a stream of photonic particles. So is light a bunch of substances moving along, right? Or is it an event, an undulation, right? A happening or occurrence. So, well, it seems like you might have to say that sometimes it's one and sometimes the other. But could something go from being a substance to being an event and vice versa? It doesn't really seem possible that the very same thing could do that. So you might just have to say in physics that there's a what you might call a transmogrification, whatever. Like, in other words, that you have a substance which goes out of being and it's replaced by energy or waves, whatever, right? But the entity is totally destroyed. Right? It doesn't seem possible to have something that's both a wave and a particle at the same time. Right? I mean, it's certainly possible to have a bunch of particles that behave like a wave. Right? Consider like an ocean wave. It's made of lots of molecules that move up and down. So that's fine. The weird thing in quantum mechanics is that you can have a single photon that under some conditions will behave like a wave. It's just one. that's if it's a whole bunch of them, there's no problem, right? Because then you just have a whole bunch of photons that are just like a whole bunch of molecules in the ocean that are moving up. And that can happen. But the trouble is you can also get these cases where you have a single photon passing through a slit, whatever that'll, under some conditions, behave as a single photon, but under other conditions will have a wave function, whatever, behave like a wave. So that's where you get into where you have to make a tough choice. Either saying that the theory is wrong somehow because it's contradictory, or that categorical essentialism is wrong, which seems like hard to swallow, right? How can it be the very same thing that switches from being a substantial particle to now being like, right, this wave? Or you can say that something goes out of existence and is replaced by something else. There seem to be other, and then you can go back and forth. So it's a conundrum, unsolved problem of physics. There are other cases of transmogrification in physics, though, so not like that's the only case. there are cases like where a piece of matter collides with a piece of antimatter, you know, like an electron collides with a positron, and then like wholly new fundamental particles are produced as a result of it. There's annihilation of both, and you get other particles that were not parts of those original particles. So it seems like at that level of existence, you can have creation and destruction out of, you know, things just emerging, right, out of cataclysmic collisions and other conditions where whole new particles that never existed before come into being. Fundamental particles, even. So they couldn't have been parts of the particles that collided. Because an electron and a positron, which is antimatter, anti-electron, which has like a positive charge. Positron's got a positive charge. It's the antimatter corresponding particle to the electron, which has a negative charge. When they collide, they self-annihilate with each other, and some other basic particles are created. So in a way, it's kind of like whole new things coming into existence with different properties. Seems to be part and parcel of modern physics all the way through. So maybe we just have to accept that those things can happen. I don't think we are forced to give up the idea of categorical essentialism, which seems to be very tough to give up on. Okay, so on that note, I'll call it a day. We'll pick up next time by looking at two alternative categorical systems, one of which divides beings into what are called universals and particulars, and so that's a division. And then there's a third possibility, which divides beings up into necessary beings and contingent beings, and then breaks down. And those seem to be the other two main alternatives to this way of doing it. And so those will be interesting to compare and contrast. I don't see any basic inconsistency or contradiction between using any of the three systems, because I think they're all capable of classifying all the possible kinds of beings. So we'll have a look at that next time.